Welcome to this deep dive. We're taking on a truly unique book today. C.G. Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It's called an autobiography, but as you'll quickly find out, it's really anything but conventional.
That's right. Jung himself was, well, deeply skeptical of autobiographies. He saw most as, attempts at self-deception.
Right.
He only wrote this one because he felt it was a kind of task imposed on him from within.
And the sources you've shared with us, well, they're excerpts from this very personal, very inner account, aren't they?
Yeah.
It gives us a chance to see how Jung viewed the landscape of his own mind.
Yeah.
He wasn't really interested in just cataloging external events, who he met, where he traveled.
No.
He even says that much of that outer stuff kind of faded because he was so completely absorbed in his inner experiences.
Mm-hmm. What becomes clear almost immediately is that for Jung, the real events of his life weren't the outward actions. They were the powerful inner things, his dreams, his visions, his fantasies. These were the core of his reality, the things that actually shaped him.
So our mission for this deep dive, then, is to explore this extraordinary inner journey, really through his own words. We want to pull out the surprising facts, the aha moments maybe, and the core insights about the psyche that came out of his intensely personal experiences.
Right. It's not a biography of his external life at all.
No, it's more like a map of his mind. And he sets the tone perfectly, doesn't he? He says, the story of a life begins somewhere. Even then, it was already highly complex. We do not know how life is going to turn out. Therefore, the story has no beginning, and the end can only be vaguely hinted at.
Which is just a fascinating way to approach telling your life story, isn't it? Focusing on the mystery, the unfolding, rather than some neat linear narrative.
Absolutely. Okay, let's dive right into that complex beginning, his childhood memories. He talks about the profound significance of living near water.
Yes, that wasn't just a geographical detail for him. It felt, well, essential, fundamental.
Yeah.
But alongside that connection to nature, there's this very early and quite disturbing memory. The corpse found in the Rhine Falls, swept over the rocks.
And though he was forbidden, he snuck a look.
He did.
What's chilling is how he links this terrifying image to nearly falling over the railing at the falls himself later on.
He saw these experiences not just as, accidents, but as signs of something deeper already at play within him, what he calls an unconscious suicidal urge, or it may be, to a fatal resistance to life in this world. Yeah, it's the insight that these powerful, potentially self-destructive psychic forces can be present from a really early age, shaping a person's path.
That's a heavy idea for a child's experience. And the atmosphere at home sounds equally, well, fraught, especially at night.
Mm-hmm.
He describes this palpable fear, hearing things, sensing frightening influences coming from his mother's room.
Mm-hmm. And this is where we get that vision of a luminous, indefinite figure whose head detached itself and floated along in front of it.
It's such a stark image, clearly linked to that environment of anxiety and, well, mystery. He also suffered from those pseudo-croup attacks, these choking fits. But during one, he had a vision of a glowing blue circle, and inside it moved golden figures, which I thought were angels.
And the really striking thing is this vision actually eased his fear. He saw this as directly connected to the psychogenic atmosphere of the house.
Meaning the emotional and psychic environment itself.
Exactly. That environment was generating these physical and visionary states. His body and mind were reacting to a disturbed atmosphere.
So the distress wasn't just random. It was a response to something real in his environment, even if not physically tangible.
Precisely. And then he identifies his first conscious trauma related to a Jesuit figure linked to these gloomy black men and death.
He felt he'd done something forbidden tied to a Jesuit's green curtain secret of the man-eater. Which, that sounds like something straight out of a nightmare.
It really does, and this connected to the Catholic Church and created years of both fear and fascination for him.
These complex, almost mythological visions in childhood led him to question their source, didn't they?
Yeah, he wondered what kind of superior intelligence was at work. He contrasted this with what he calls the optimistic tadpoles, who just, deny such inconvenient possibilities. This early questioning really set him apart.
He was drawn to unsettling things. The dead man, watching a pig slaughtering, much to his mother's dismay. And then there's that really profound connection to the stone he sat on for hours as a child.
Yes, he felt this deep, secret relationship with this stone. What's remarkable is he went back 30 years later and felt the exact same connection.
Really?
Yeah, finding his adult life in Zurich seemed almost alien compared to the reality of that connection. It just highlights this deep, abiding link he felt to the elemental world, something that stayed with him his entire life.
And then there's the famous story of the mannequin in the pencil box, hidden in the attic beam.
Ah, yes. This was a solemn ceremonial act, adding scrolls with writing in a secret language. He interpreted this later as his first conscious attempt to give shape to the secret.
To give form to that inner world.
Exactly, to give form to the mysterious inner world he was experiencing. He identified the mannequin as a little cloaked god of the ancient world, a telesphoros, kind of healing spirit.
And this symbolic act led to a really profound insight, didn't it? The conviction that archaic psychic components, what he'd later call archetypes,
Right.
enter the individual psyche without direct lineage, genetically or environmentally. They're just there, part of the human inheritance.
That's a huge idea, and it came from a childhood secret. He also talks about becoming aware of his mother having two personalities.
The loving day mother and the uncanny, archaic, and ruthless night mother.
Yes. He saw this duality in her as a source of his anxiety dreams, and importantly, recognized the same archaic primal nature within himself.
And he noted that her knowledge sometimes felt like a voice of absolute authority.
But after hearing conflicting accounts from her, he made a conscious decision, even as a child, he says, to divide everything my mother said by two.
That's quite a striking move for a kid.
Isn't it? It shows this early, independent critical thinking, a refusal to just accept unquestioned authority, even from his own mother. And this discernment would become absolutely crucial in his later work.
It's fascinating how these early experiences really laid the groundwork. Let's shift a bit to his navigation of the outer world, particularly school. He describes finding defeats in drawing and gymnastics.
Which he saw not just as failures, right? But as expressions of his resistance to external control, a refusal to be molded. He felt increasingly distant from the conventional world, fleeing from himself, as he put it, by wasting time.
And then came the psychogenic fainting fits, specifically when trying to force himself to study Latin.
Yeah, this wasn't just anxiety. It was like his body staging a revolt against being forced onto a path that didn't align with his inner nature.
But he overcame them.
He did. His determination to overcome these fits, forcing himself to study despite the attacks, shows this fierce will to integrate his inner resistance with outer demands, even if it was painful.
He also had these intense experiences of recognition, like seeing a specific carriage or doctor's shoes, and feeling this uncanny familiarity.
Yes, he describes a feeling of nostalgia, as if he was being cheated out of my beloved past. It speaks to that sense he often had of belonging to previous centuries.
Like part of him was outside linear time.
Exactly, resonating with things from the past.
Then there was his deep struggle with the most terrible sin, the sin against the Holy Ghost. The anxiety sounds immense.
Oh, it was. He wrestled with the conventional understanding of sin, really questioning God's intentions. He even entertained the, well, pretty provocative idea that God might force abominations just to experience the contrast, the grace.
That wasn't just idle theological speculation for him.
Not at all. It was a profound personal wrestling match with the nature of good, evil, and the divine. It left him feeling like a devil or a swine, but paradoxically, finding resonance with the idea of reprobates being chosen.
And he found a strange relief when he actually did commit minor wrongs.
Yes, because then, he thought, at least he knew what my guilty conscience was for.
It's a stark illustration, isn't it? That psychological need to attach internal turmoil to an external cause, no matter how trivial.
A very human, if kind of counterintuitive response to free-floating guilt. He was also profoundly disappointed in his father's theology.
Yes, he felt his father was hopelessly entrapped by the church, unable to engage with the deep religious questions that obsessed Jung.
And this left Jung feeling intellectually and spiritually isolated, didn't it? An outsider to his father's faith and the church until he got to university.
This isolation must have pushed him further into his own explorations. There's also the accusation of cheating on compositions.
Right. He felt branded by this, believing it cut him off from paths which might have led me out of unusualness. It's like an external judgment confirming his internal feeling of being different.
And the nickname Father Abraham he received, he felt it hit the mark.
Yeah, highlighting that growing divergence between his country world, which was God's world, full of secret meaning, and the city world, which seemed blind to all this depth.
This inner split is really reflected in his intellectual search, too. He wavered between science, the concrete facts for his number one personality, as he called it,
Right, the practical side.
and the humanities, the spiritual problems for his number two.
He saw this as a mirror of his inner dichotomy. Science lacked meaning for number two, while religion lacked, well, empiricism for number one. He felt number two had no real pied-à-terre, no solid ground, but it was the part that lifted him beyond the mundane.
This search eventually led him to spiritualist literature, like Zollner and Crookes.
And he read these not as just occult ramblings, but as accounts of objective psychic phenomena. Empirical evidence, he thought, that contrasted sharply with the urban world's ignorance.
So even though they were weird and questionable,
Yes, they were the first accounts he found of things existing outside the conventional scientific box. It really sparked his interest in the objective reality of the psyche itself.
which brings us neatly to his path toward psychiatry. It seems like the perfect field to bridge those dual interests. He describes his time at Berg-Holtzley Mental Hospital and the isolation around mental illness back then.
He noted the subjective character of psychiatric texts at the time, basically. Doctors were projecting their own lack of understanding onto the patients.
But then came that lightning bolt moment, reading a definition of psychoses as diseases of the personality. His heart pounded, he says.
Instantly, he knew psychiatry was the only possible goal for him.
Because it brought everything together.
Exactly. It was the place where his biological interest, number one, and his spiritual or psychic interest, number two, could finally converge. He began working with patients, seeing beyond the apparent tragic destruction to the active life of that side of the psyche which is turned away, the unconscious.
Which demanded real engagement.
Attentive engagement, yes, not just diagnosis.
This led to his development of the association test and experimental psychopathology.
And crucially, that profound insight into the necessity of the analysis of the analyst, what we now call training analysis. He realized the therapist's own psychological state is absolutely fundamental.
His quote on this is so stark. If you are not, God help you, then you will lead patients astray. It makes the therapist's self-awareness an ethical imperative, doesn't it?
Totally. It's a radical statement about the therapist being an instrument of healing, which must itself be, well, in tune. He recounts cases, the mother complex alcoholism case where he used an active force measure, a strong intervention.
Or the hypnosis patient.
Right, where despite a cure, he abandoned hypnosis because he hadn't understood the why. He wanted to analyze the unconscious to find the patient's natural bent, their own intrinsic path.
He even observed parapsychological phenomena happening within therapy itself, like intense transference.
Yes, mentioning an impressive case involving a healed patient's wife. And one case that really highlights his unique approach was the young woman with severe anxiety neurosis. Standard approaches failed. Then, remembering his own recent dream about a grandfather.
He asked her about her grandfather. And what happened?
It opened the floodgates. It connected her issues directly to the world of the ancestors and, more broadly, to the loss of myth in modern life.
So her neurosis wasn't inevitable.
No, he saw it as optional, a result of a disconnection from this deeper collective dimension of the psyche. The insight is that modern psychological suffering can stem from a lack of connection to this ancestral and mythical substrate.
Which links directly to his critique of concept-ridden intellectuals.
Yes, those who live purely in abstract ideas, avoiding the messy reality of experience and the unconscious. He states it clearly. The spirit does not dwell in concepts, but in deeds and in facts.
Intellectualizing as a defense.
Pretty much. A defense against experiencing the depth and difficulty of the psyche.
Which really sets the stage for his famous and eventually quite painful encounter with Sigmund Freud. He was initially drawn to Freud's interpretation of dreams.
He initially found Freud's ideas validating, especially the repression mechanism, and he felt the initial relationship was extremely valuable, almost like a son finding a father figure in the field.
But conceptual cracks started to appear pretty quickly. Jung felt Freud's singular focus on sexuality wasn't just science.
No, it was almost like replacing a jealous God lost, giving sexuality these sort of divine attributes.
He saw this through the lens of the Power problem, didn't he? Connecting it, maybe surprisingly, to Nietzsche.
Yeah, Nietzsche focused on the will to power. Jung felt Freud's psychology was a necessary compensation, bringing the problem of love and power into stark relief within psychology itself.
And there was that specific disagreement over parapsychology. Jung was open to studying it empirically.
But Freud rejected it outright. Jung saw this as Freud's shallow positivism, a refusal to engage with phenomena that didn't fit his existing materialistic framework.
Even though Jung saw them as empirical facts of the psyche.
Exactly. Facts to be explored, not dismissed.
The ultimate breaking point came during a dream analysis session with Freud himself.
Right. Jung was asking Freud for personal associations to one of Freud's dreams, which is standard analytic practice, but Freud refused. He said he couldn't risk his authority.
And that rigid refusal.
It showed Jung that Freud had to take refuge in his doctrine, that he was completely helpless when a dream fell outside his rigid framework. Jung realized the limitations of Freud's approach, especially for certain kinds of deep, symbolic dreams.
And around this time, Jung had his own hugely significant house dream.
Oh, yeah. He experienced that dream as this vivid representation of his psyche structure. The conscious facade, the salon, then deeper levels, the ground floor, the cellar, the Roman cellar, the prehistoric cave.
Yeah.
This dream gave him an immediate, felt understanding of the multi-layered psyche. It allowed him to formulate his own structural model and really solidify his more critical attitude toward Freud. And the second part of the dream, an Italian city, a night he described as numinous in the extreme.
On sparring power.
Beyond rational explanation.
So his own inner experiences, especially this dream, were guiding him toward a completely different understanding of the psyche than Freud's.
Exactly. The unconscious wasn't just a dumping ground for repressed wishes. It was a dynamic, structured reality with its own intelligence, its own architecture, which he experienced directly.
This divergence led to what he describes as an incredibly intense period after the break with Freud, roughly 1913 to 1917. He calls it his confrontation with the unconscious.
And he felt genuinely menaced by psychosis. This wasn't just a theoretical exercise for him. It was a harrowing descent. He had these powerful visions, like Europe being flooded with blood.
And recurring dreams of an Arctic cold wave freezing the land.
Yes, and the striking thing is, these visions and dreams happened before World War I broke out.
So he saw them as objective.
Exactly. Objective psychic phenomena. Not just personal fantasies, but signals from a deeper collective level of the psyche, sensing the impending global catastrophe. It confirmed for him that the unconscious connects us to something much larger than ourselves.
To navigate this potential flood, he made an intentional descent. He actively engaged with these inner images and figures.
Yes, he encountered figures like Elijah, representing intelligence or logos, and Salome, representing the erotic element eros. These weren't abstract ideas for him. They were living inner personalities.
And then there was the emergence of Philemon.
Philemon represented superior insight, a kind of guiding spirit or guru figure within his psyche. What gave this immense inner experience objective validity for Jung was a really striking synchronicity.
Oh.
Shortly after dreaming of Philemon with kingfisher wings, he found a dead kingfisher in his garden.
No way.
Yes. It felt like confirmation from the external world that this inner figure was real, objective, and significant.
He does admit he was afraid of being completely taken over by this other world of the unconscious.
Understandably. But the grounding reality of his family and his profession kept him tethered. He invoked the phrase, high rotus, high salta, here is Rhodes, here jump, meaning, prove yourself here, in reality.
Integrate, don't escape.
Exactly. He had to integrate these inner experiences into his actual life.
The urge to give form to these overwhelming inner contents led to the writing of the Septem Sermons ad Mortuos, the 7 Sermons to the Dead.
He felt literally haunted by a ghostly assemblage until he wrote this text. It just poured out of him in 3 evenings, and as soon as it was written, the haunting stopped. The atmosphere cleared. It was his first attempt to really articulate the fundamental truths he'd gleaned from this confrontation.
He emphasizes the critical role of science during this period.
Yes, but not just science for intellectual understanding, more as a method, a framework to avoid being strangled by the chaos.
Yeah.
It was a way to classify the images, to make sense of them, and crucially to realize them in actual life.
So science provided the container.
And life provided the expression.
He saw an ethical obligation coming from these unconscious images too.
Absolutely. Failure to understand and act on these insights, to integrate them, he believed, leads to the dominance of the power principle and psychic fragmentariness. Living the unconscious insights ethically is essential for wholeness.
He struggled immensely to articulate these experiences, didn't he? Feeling struck dumb.
Yes, he realized he needed a completely new way of speaking, a new orientation, to convey that the contents of psychic experience are real, collective experiences, not just individual pathology or quirks.
And it was during this crucible that he discovered the mandala.
The mandala emerged for him as a symbol of psychic totality and the self, the regulating center of the psyche. For him, drawing mandalas served as a kind of protective circle and helped concentrate his focus.
And the dream of the Yellow Castle.
The Yellow Castle, or city, yeah, that was a climax, symbolizing the self as the principle and archetype of orientation and meaning, the inner compass.
So this intense inner period was really the forge where his core concepts were hammered out.
It really was. It was the necessary, although terrifying, journey into the depth that gave birth to his entire psychological system.
Let's look at how he then took these inner discoveries and embodied them in the outer world. Perhaps most famously, through building his tower at Bollingen.
He described building the tower as a necessity, a physical act to give concrete form, a representation in stone, even a confession of faith to his deepest thoughts and experiences.
The symbolism is so layered. Built near water, echoing his childhood connection.
Right.
He added on to it over his lifetime, each edition reflecting a new stage of his psychological development. And living there simply, no electricity, no running water, that felt essential.
He believed this simplicity helped him become simple and allowed his thoughts to connect back through the centuries. He carved a stone there with an inscription about his 75th birthday and the tower, calling it a manifestation of the occupant, but one which remains incomprehensible to others.
A personal symbol of the self.
Exactly. Built for his own integration, not really for public understanding.
He connected deeply to the past and his ancestors at the tower through symbolic acts, didn't he? Burying a soldier's skeleton found nearby.
Yeah, his daughter sensed the body first, connecting it to his maternal grandmother.
And carving his paternal ancestors' names into a stone.
Yes, these were conscious acts to acknowledge the fateful links and the influence of unresolved issues from his lineage. He felt that in the tower, one lives as if, in many centuries, integrating the past and present within the self.
His travels also served as psychic observation posts. He sought out different cultures to see the European perspective from the outside, like sitting in an Arab coffee house.
Observing gestures and emotions when language was a barrier, sensing the underlying human connection. This search for different perspectives led him to the Taos Pueblo Indians and that memorable conversation with Chief Oshwe Biano.
What was the core difference he perceived there?
He saw that the European talks with his head, living mostly in concepts and intellect, while the Indian talks with his heart, feeling the great mystery, that connection to nature and the divine everywhere.
And the chief's question.
Do you not think that all life comes from the mountain? That struck Jung's vulnerable spot.
Why was that so impactful for him?
Because it revealed the European's fundamental detachment from nature, from the deep instinctual reality that he felt still nourished indigenous cultures. It highlighted what Western man had lost.
In Africa, Kenya, and Uganda, he experienced a profound divine peace and a sense of liberated psychic forces. He observed the native religion's focus on the moment of sunrise, Etista, as God.
Contrasting it with the fear of night spirits, Ayik. He describes a dance ceremony where the drumming led to a state of possession, transforming the dancers into a wild horde. Navigating that powerful collective psychic energy firsthand was a visceral experience for him.
He saw his journey from Africa to Egypt as a kind of
A drama of the birth of light, mirroring the emergence of consciousness from primeval darkness, a psychological journey, not just geographical.
In India, at Konarak, he met a pandit who offered a surprising interpretation of the temple's, well, obscene images.
The pandit explained they weren't base, but necessary reminders of dharma, of law. People needed to be reminded of their sexuality, which the pandit saw as necessary for consciousness itself.
Another cultural perspective on integrating instincts.
Exactly. Not repressing, but integrating. He reflected on Buddhism, too, seeing Buddha as an image of self-development, the idea that anyone can become a Buddha through their own efforts. And he saw the Balinese dance not as adoration, but the drumming as self-redemption.
These cross-cultural encounters seem crucial.
They provided empirical confirmation for him that the patterns and symbols he was discovering in the Western unconscious weren't unique to the West, but fundamental aspects of the human psyche globally.
Moving towards his later reflections, he recounts intense visions during a serious illness in 1944, a rock temple, a garden of pomegranates, a mystic marriage.
He felt as if he existed in this objective reality, having completed his life. Upon recovery, the everyday world seemed gray by comparison. He experienced a profound sense of sanctity from this brush with death and the transpersonal realm.
And this illness was a turning point. leading to a powerful realization about life's path.
Yes, the importance of affirming one's own destiny, accepting mistakes, peril, the challenges. He felt the sure road was dead. Embracing the uncertainty and difficulties of one's unique path was the only way to forge the ego and avoid psychic death.
He also pondered life after death, contrasting critical rationalism with the enduring power of myth.
He speculated that a part of the psyche might exist outside of space and time, citing things like synchronicity and J.B. Rhine's ESP experiments as possible evidence for a subjective persistence of consciousness.
And his own dreams seemed to support this.
Yes, dreams like the one about a bewigged gentleman before his mother's death, which seemed to carry messages from the dead or ancestral layers, referencing his father's unsolved problem.
He mentions Buddha's approach, too.
Avoiding the question of personal karma to focus on the nidana chain, the cycle of birth, life, old age, death. And he even entertained the provocative thought that for some souls, three-dimensional empirical existence might actually be more blissful than eternity.
A late dream from 1958 involving metallic discs expressed that fundamental polarity he explored his whole life, conscious and unconscious.
He connected this to the idea that knowing our limited uniqueness, our individual empirical existence, actually allows for a consciousness of the infinite, the boundless. It's the particular that reveals the universal.
He reflected deeply on the modern condition, the loss of grounding myths like the Christian narrative, and the confrontation with overwhelming evil seen in totalitarianism.
He argued that because we've lost our myths, we desperately need self-knowledge to reach the fundamental stratum, the instincts and the unconscious that actually governs ethics.
The unconscious can't be fully grasped by consciousness.
No, science itself calls it unconscious. But the empirical fact is the human sense of dependence on this core, which has historically been called mana, daemon, or God.
He saw symbols as crucial for uniting opposites and giving shape to life. The myth of necessary incarnation, he felt, was man's creative confrontation with the opposites within the self.
And the ultimate goal, he mused, might be the incarnation of the divine in empirical man, the full realization of the transpersonal in the individual human life.
He made a powerful link between meaninglessness and illness, didn't he?
Yes, stating that meaning, even suffering, makes things endurable, and science alone can never replace the meaning provided by myth.
The central danger for modern man, he believed.
Identifying only with the conscious mind, fearing the unconscious, and lacking objectivity towards our own inner depths.
Finally, looking back on his own incredible life journey, he spoke of a recurring feeling of being alone.
Alone because he felt he knew things others didn't, or perhaps didn't want to know things revealed by his deep dive into the unconscious.
He felt his path was determined by early dreams and unconscious processes, accepting how his life unfolded by destiny. He admitted regretting some of his obstinacy,
but recognized its necessity to reach his goal. He ends his reflection saying he is both disappointed and not disappointed.
a paradox that really reflects the complexity of his life's work and maybe the nature of the psyche itself.
I think so.
Wow. What an incredible journey through Jung's inner landscape, guided by his own reflections. We've seen how his personal experiences, those disturbing visions, the profound symbols, the wrestling with opposites, weren't just biographical anecdotes, were they?
Not at all. They were the very soil from which his groundbreaking psychological concepts grew. We've explored the vital reality of the unconscious, the power of symbols and dreams as guides, the lifelong process of individuation, the essential confrontation with the shadow and other opposites, and, well, the fundamental human search for meaning in a world that often feels fragmented.
It really makes you consider your own inner life, doesn't it? How do your dreams speak to you? How do you navigate the opposing forces within yourself? And where do you find connection or perhaps disconnection from what Jung might call the great mystery in this modern world?
And as he reflected at his tower, how are you integrating the deep patterns and influences of the historical family within you with the fleeting conditions of your present life?
Something to ponder deeply. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.